Okay, we're recording. We're ready to go.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody once again, and good to see some new faces there too. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Carmen Dell'Aversano from the University of Pisa. She's contributed a lot to PCP over the years in some very interesting topic areas. Critical queer studies, sexuality, surrealism. Now my memory escapes me. But the main upshot is that she is an expert on literary theory and literary criticism and teaches courses in various places, the university as well as the two constructivist psychology institutes in Italy, based in Florence and Padua. I first met Carmen in Padua when I first went to teach there, and she was responsible for me getting into the founder of pragmatism, Charles Peirce, and his semiotics and all his other interests, which has been a hugely productive find for me. So I'm ever grateful to her for that. She's going to talk today, I think, about two particular theorists who got a lot from phenomenology. PCP has been classified as a phenomenologist by Trevor Butt and Maria Armezzani and Gabriele Chiari. And so there's a lot of interest in comparing and dipping into those phenomenological theories that look at the reading process, particularly as she is going to talk about today, Wolfgang Iser, who talks about the experience of reading being a constructing, the individual constructing the narrative and the world in the book that they're reading, in the text. Well, I won't ramble on anymore. So Carmen, let me welcome you again. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Harry, and thanks to everybody who's been organizing this Zoom meeting series for keeping the PCP community together over a very trying time. Actually, my thanks should stretch way back to my very first meeting with the people of PCP at the 2006 European Personal Construct Association Conference. All my life, I've been wandering among disciplines from classics to queer studies, to rhetorics, to comparative literature, to Jewish studies, to critical animal studies. And over my 35 years in international academia, I have never met a group from the very first day, I was made to feel both valued as a researcher and welcome as a person. From the very outset, the most knowledgeable and competent people on an international level interacted with me in such a way as to make me feel that I had something to contribute to the PCP community. I've been invited to teach in therapist training institutes, to contribute to special issues of journal, and to sit on editorial boards. Some of these people are listening to me right now, and I would like them to know that I never took and will never take their generosity and openness for granted, that I will always be grateful to you for giving this restless wanderer a family and a home. My request to all of you is ask questions. I wrote out the entire presentation and mapped it out in slides. And the reason why I did this is that I want you to feel free to interrupt me with objections, questions, random associations, without feeling that you might make me lose my thread, because I won't. You know, the PCP motto is If you don't understand what someone is up to, ask them. Well, ask me. I have no ambition that what I wrote out and mapped out will be objectively clear, because there's no such thing as objectively clear. There's just me, a person, talking to you, other persons, and trying to communicate. But unless you give me feedback, I will never know whether I'm communicating or not. So please speak up. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to share my presentation. Because this is the very first quote from James Baldwin, which I found in Dennis Hinkle's wonderful autobiography, Burning Point. If you can't be touched, you can't be changed. And if you can't be changed, you can't be alive. And I would like us all to keep hold of this quote while we make our way through my argument. Now, my first observation is that we all know that Kelly scattered throughout the 2 volumes of the Psychology of Personal Constructs a number of recommendations and prescriptions to therapists. And if we piece these parts of the 2 volumes together, we get a portrait of what the PCP therapist should be like. Now, I would like to draw our attention to a fact that, in my opinion, has not been sufficiently focused on in the literature, in the PCP literature, and maybe also in the practice of PCP, that a considerable number of the qualities, abilities, and reactions, which Kelly mentions as being desirable, indeed as being indispensable to practicing PCP, can be viewed as subordinate constructs of one very specific kind of competence. And the reason why I find this interesting is that this competence is normally does not normally have a place in the curriculum, in the syllabus, in Therapist Training Institute. And this competence is literary competence. Don Bannister, as we all remember, was not only the person who was responsible for making PCP a global success, but also an anarchist and a novelist. And he was thus in the best position to make out the considerable similarities between literature and PCP. Bannister wrote that the therapist should possess, I quote, the talents of the novelist in entering into other people's worlds. Now, this enlightening observation can be elaborated analytically by making close reference to Kelly's work, and this is what I would like us to do together now. The first and the most enlightening parallel between Kelly's recommendation to PCP practitioners of PCP and competent readers of literature is to be found in the basic attitude Kelly recommends, which is, as we all know, the credulous attitude, the credulous approach. I'm reading the Kelly quote. The personal construct psychologist starts by taking what he sees and hears at face value. He even takes at face value what he sees and hears about his subject's constructs. In psychotherapy, this is commonly called, quote unquote, acceptance of the patient. For Sullivan, it would be, quote, learning the language of the patient, unquote. Our term, which we will elaborate later, is the credulous attitude. Second passage, the credulous approach. The third important implication of the fundamental postulate is that the clinician should maintain a kind of credulous attitude toward whatever the client says. He never discards information given by the client merely because it does not conform to what appear to be the facts. From a phenomenological point of view, the client, like the proverbial customer, is always right. That is to say, that his words and his symbolic behaviors possess an intrinsic truth, which the clinician should not ignore. The perceptive clinician always respects the content of the client's lies, although he is equally careful not to be misled by them. When he discovers that what a client says does not agree with what actually happened, he is careful to lay out both versions side by side and not erase the client's version in order to replace it with the quote-unquote true version. He is even inclined to ponder over the client's version more than he is to derive a conclusion from the quote-unquote true version. Now, regarding the credulous attitude, it is worth noting that this construct is first introduced systematically as a preliminary to the self-characterization, that is, to the closest equivalent in PCP to a theory of the analysis of literary texts. The paragraph which follows the passages I just quoted is entitled "The Self-Characterization as an Application of the Credulous Approach." So in order to make sense of a self-characterization, in order for the self-characterization to be of any use in the psychotherapy process, therapists are not a therapist, the therapist must stick to the credulous approach. Now, the second extensive reference to the credulous approach occurs as a preliminary to what I would like us all to realize is an avowedly literary task, that is, the writing of the first of the fixed role sketch. Kellyan expected PCP practitioners to be able to write roles, that is, to embody the talents of a dramatic writer. And how do we do that? Let's see. Certainly, it appears that there should be a kind of acceptance of the client running through the theme of the first role sketch. Acceptance, as it appears in most current psychological and psychiatric writings, seems to be a pretty vague term. We have attempted to make it communicable by defining it as the willingness to see the world through the other person's eyes. It thus becomes a precondition for the intentional adoption of role relationships. Since the psychology of personal constructs lays great stress upon the interpretation of the regnancy of the construct under which acts may be performed, rather than upon the mere acts themselves, and since it lays great stress upon personal constructs rather than the formalistic constructs, it does demand of the psychologist that he have an acceptance of other persons. One might even say that the psychology of personal constructs is, among other things, a psychology of acceptance. Now, it takes skill and ingenuity to put acceptance into practice. It also takes courage. Some clinicians are so afraid to be taken in by their clients that they're afraid to accept them. Some clinicians may even be shocked by the notion of the credulous clinical approach we have proposed. Now, we might stop here and have mapped out before us a complete theory of the intrinsic, not only compatibility, but reciprocal implication between reading with full participation and listening to the client, patient, person in front of the therapist, whatever you like to call them. However, on occasion, Kellyan seems to take away with one hand what he's been giving with the other. And it is very interesting and very enlightening to witness what the limits of the credulous approach are for the very proponent of the credulous approach. As we suggested previously, there is a useful adage for clinical psychologists to follow on occasion. If you do not know what is wrong with a person, ask him. He might tell you. The clinician who asks such a question will have to be prepared to do some careful listening. For the answer, will be couched in terms of the respondent's personal construct, not only of himself, but of the psychology of the situation. He may say, in effect, I don't think you would understand if I told you. Or he may say, by means of polite conventions, nothing is wrong with me that the elimination of people like you wouldn't remedy. Or he may launch into an elaborate explanation whose very complexity suffices to make it clear how difficult and labored must be every decision by which he maintains himself from day to day. Now, here, in Kelly's own words, in Kelly's own description of what the therapist is supposed to do with the person's answer, we can witness subsuming at work. We can actually realize what Kelly means when he says that the therapist professional construct system must be structured in such a way as to subsume the client's personal construct system. Now, we can now appreciate the key role that the therapist's personal constructs necessarily, inevitably, but unwittingly play in subsuming. And this happens also, indeed, this happens above all when the clinician's attention is focused not on the content of the client's construct system, however potentially destabilizing this content may be. After all, in the first two cases, let me go back, Kelly is assuming that what the patient is saying is that the therapist is incompetent, or that the patient is wishing for the therapist's elimination. He, on the last third of this quote, Kelly is focusing on the form of the patient's construct system. He says that the patient may launch into an elaborate explanation whose very complexity suffices to make it clear how difficult and labored must be every decision by which he maintains himself from day to day. Now, I will try to be clinically impersonal and say that this construction of the patient's construction processes may be an artifact of the patient's, of the therapist's own construct system. This does not necessarily reveal anything about the subject construct system. The analogy is with natural languages. I am speaking English very imperfectly, as all the native speakers of English who are listening to me painfully realize. But from my imperfect command of the English language, I'm absolutely not entitled to draw the conclusion that the phonetic system of the English language is unnecessarily complex and laborious. I'm simply not a native speaker of English. It's as simple as that. Exactly like that, there is nothing necessarily difficult and labored about the construct system of the person talking to us. It is their construct system. Now, what I find interesting about this passage is that this passage, along with a number of other passages in the 2 volumes of the Psychology of Personal Constructs, which for obvious reasons I cannot bring up here, shows in the most unmistakable, in the clearest way, that no matter what Kelly maintains about the particular nature of the subsuming system, subsuming is invariably accomplished through the use, alongside the explicit and rigorous system of professional constructs offered by PCP theory, by use of a submerged system of personal constructs. There is no way to use PCP professional constructs except through one's own personal constructs. Now, this may sound so trivial that you might wonder what the point is of mentioning this, except that it is not necessarily trivial, because what I just said contradicts what Kelly writes elsewhere. The clinician is not only tolerant of the various points of view represented by his clients, but he is willing to devote himself to the defense of facilitation of widely different patterns of life. Diversity and multiple experimentation are to be encouraged, and this is wonderful. However, well-meaning pronouncements such as this one, which are of course echoed by the most authoritative popularizations of PCP, engender a contradiction. The contradiction arises from the refusal. Yes?
Would you indulge me in a question, please? I'm tracking the argument. It's going in a very interesting direction. But before I can continue tracking, there's one query I have.
Yes.
On the previous slide.
Yes, let me go back to this. Is this the slide you?
Yes, you offered a contrast between subsuming and offering a rival system. Does it have to be either in your analysis, or can we not just say, look, there are two different ways of looking at things, the therapists and the clients? I can see if I was a therapist why it may be important for me to think I am subsuming, but maybe it's just constructive alternativism, just two different ways of looking.
This is the whole point. Thank you. Absolutely. But if we look at therapists' construct system as the therapist construct system, then subsuming becomes extremely difficult as a theoretical position to defend. Because Kelly himself says that a subsuming system is not a rival system. He, in this quote, establishes a dichotomy between a subsuming system and a rival system. Now, my impression is that whenever we apply a professional construct of PCP, for instance, the person is constricting, the person is hostile, the person is whatever, we are doing so, and we cannot help but do so by applying our own personal construct to the professional constructs. For instance, I may be focusing a lot of attention on learning Spanish. I am neglecting German. Now, which shall it be? This, of course, is something which has nothing to do, which does not necessarily have to do with psychological issues as we are accustomed to conceiving of them. Let's have another example. A person may have a problematic relationship with their troubled teenage son and an elderly parent who needs attention. Whatever the person does, they will have to devote less of their energies to one of these relationships than to the other. So they will conceivably be constricting in one important area of their relations. Of course, these are extremely simplistic examples, but did I manage to explain what I was aiming at?
Yes, in the sense that the thing that made most sense to me was when you said the therapist is using professional constructs, but he or she is using their own constructs as the vehicle through which the professional ones are expressed. So, I mean, okay, yeah, I'm following that.
Yeah, that's okay. Is there something I had better explain? Is there something else which is not clear?
How about this? Are you pro-subsuming or anti-subsuming?
I am in favor of reflexivity in subsuming.
That's great.
That is, if I feel I can use this professional construct in making sense of the patient's experience, what in my own system of personal constructs is guiding me in that direction?
Would you also would you also be congenial to the idea that there may not be the therapist's personal constructs and then professional constructs, that they could be intertwined one and the same, that once the therapist appropriates those constructs, they become indistinguishable perhaps from his or her construct?
Totally, yes, absolutely. And this, in my opinion, makes reflexivity more urgent, but also more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody's always going on about how therapists change in therapy as well as patients.
Yeah.
And this is the whole point.
I don't know if you were, I don't know if I'll be representing your position correctly or not. I'll just make the comment. It does seem to me that subsuming is in some sense necessary in the therapeutic relationship, and does not have to be a rivalry, because if a therapist is going to help the client explore something, well, the therapist has got to hold what the client is saying and much more. And so the therapist can help the client with his or her own construct system, even disagreeing with it and subsuming it at the same time.
When you
subsuming it relatively subsuming it. You never subsume entirely.
When you say and much more, you are assuming that you can see the patient's construct system from outside.
There's no outside, but I do want to, while at the same time saying that subsumption is an ideal that we can never reach, I don't want to throw out the idea, if you will, in everyday terms, that in some domains the therapist knows more than the client. I don't want to throw that out.
No, I don't want, as I tried to say, I don't want to throw subsuming out. I would like us all to become more interested in how, as you suggested, personal and professional concepts enmesh in the therapist's construct, way of construing and way of experiencing. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Presumably, the assumption that the therapist, in some sense, is capable of subsuming the client's constructs is because the therapist belongs to a community of knowledge and practice, which is perhaps wider in its realm of discourse, in the applicability of its constructs, than the client's. Does that make sense? That is That is, by the way, a very daft laddie question. The Scots have this notion of the daft laddie question, the question posed by somebody who's a bit of an idiot in the field, which may nevertheless be helpful.
Excuse me, I need the construct of, I need the construct of the daft laddie question. Where can I find literature about it?
Oh, it's just a phrase that my Scottish colleagues told me about.
Okay, this is wonderful. No, I think that I think that what you say is extremely important and interesting, and it steers us in a social constructionist direction, which is maybe not exactly what Kelly envisioned, but is something which I personally find extremely interesting.
Would you just indulge me in one other memory? If we're talking about subsuming things, I once very tentatively suggested that, you know, maybe the constructivist perspective subsumes the positivist one. The positivist approach to knowledge is simply another way of construing what's going on. And Jack Adams Weber jumped on me very rapidly and said, no, that's nonsense. It isn't like that, but I never quite worked out why he said that. I still hold it as a, you know, as a possible tenable belief.
Of course, because I am a constructivist, I agree with you. But because I am a constructivist, I doubt that. Yes, I have switched off the PowerPoint sharing. I also feel that a positivist might not agree with us. And I also believe, because I am a constructivist, that there is no superordinate position that we can attain in order to decide between us and the positivist who is right. Of course, I feel that you and I are right.
I'm a developmental psychologist. I believe unapologetically that there are levels of development in people's understanding. And I believe that in certain domains, people can be at a higher level of development in their thinking and feeling, etc., than someone else. And in those situations, it is possible to largely have this subsumption, if you will. And if let's not say me, if you, Carmen, can explain very well what positivism is and what constructivism is, and the positivist can't, can only explain the positivist position by some standards, I think it is reasonable to say that that one has a more relatively subsuming process than the other.
In my experience, there are two things that tend to happen. The first is that the positivist does not agree with the way that I explain their position. So I can explain the positivist position in a satisfactory way because you find it satisfactory. And the reason why you, Michael, find it satisfactory is because we're both constructivists. That at least is my own experience with positivists. I mean, by positivists, put religious fundamentalists, liberist economists, I mean, you name it. It's always the same experience.
Can I just jump in, because I'm having read the quotes that you sent around as well, Carmen. If you push this further, I mean, you could say the constructivist can explain the positivist position, but the positivist can't explain the constructivist.
This is not what I said. This is what Michael said.
Okay, but then if you push that to the limit, and the quotes illustrate it with your use of literary theory, it becomes very difficult to justify the developmental position that Michael's creating, because you're talking about the construction in the moment in response to the literature of different positions. And so this notion that you can privilege some sort of truth over some other sort, which I think is what I'm understanding under this idea of subsumption, becomes very difficult to defend from a purely constructivist position.
I guess there may be a problem, but because the position that you started out, that you stated at the outset is not my position, but Michael's position, I feel that Michael should answer the question.
Okay.
I kind of feel as though that I'm speaking too much. I'll be very, very brief. The example that I gave of the constructivist subsuming the positivists was just an example. It could be the other way around as well. That's all I'll say.
May I ask a question which may actually show that I don't understand what you're talking about, but I think I do. My question is, we're throwing terminology around. We're making divisions between groups. Where does your position, how does your position consider the concept of standing on the shoulders of giants and developing new fields of thought by subsuming other people's ideas and focusing on them differently or reconstruing them in the light of somebody else's thought?
I do that all the time. I love your question because one field of activity that neither Harry nor I mentioned is that I'm a collage artist.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I'm thinking that.
In my intellectual life, I'm a collage artist as well. I try to put together tools from different conceptual, theoretical toolboxes in order to achieve an understanding of issues which I find interesting. And one thing that I had to realize very, very early on is that I often create what the original authors of these positions would consider monsters. For instance, one of my most important theoretical points of reference is René Girard, the Catholic fundamentalist who crafted an entirely novel idea of entirely novel theory of desire. He's one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century period. And in my opinion, Girard gives his best when we realize that his ontological position is completely constructionist. But Girard himself was a Catholic fundamentalist and would have reacted with horror at this suggestion. I went to the World Congress of Girard Studies and told people, look, you're all social constructionists, and they basically wanted to lynch me. So I think there's no way for me to survive intellectually without doing exactly what you described. On the other hand, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I'm very lucky that there's no copyright on theories and ideas, because people might actually bar me from using their concepts and theories if they knew what I'm doing with them. I don't know whether I answered your question at all.
I'm in very much a similar position to you in that I am mixing and matching and cooking a stew, if you like.
Yeah.
And what I really would like to know, I suppose, from what you've said here is what would be the therapist's position if they were to have to explain to themselves through their own constructs a client's position which borrows from various different disciplines or various different ideas, to somebody who talks in mythological terms and in social terms and in relational terms and in familial terms?
I think that would be absolutely great. On the other hand, my ambition in this presentation is much more modest. Mm-hmm. What I would like to do is to discuss with all of you some conceptual tools and some practical exercises which may make especially therapist trainees, students of therapist training institutes, which are the people I normally interact with, more self-reflexive about their own personal construct system. Mm-hmm. So what you said is wonderful, but it's so much more advanced than what I had planned to discuss. So I would love to discuss this further, but I was not prepared to discuss this.
Okay.
But this, what you're saying is great. I love it.
Can I throw a quick one on? Sorry, just Carmen, when you're saying that you're talking to positivists and comparing two frameworks of thinking, can you describe positivism to a positivist to the satisfaction of the positivist?
As I said when talking to Michael, no, and that's the whole point.
So if that's the case, how can we be sure that you haven't just misunderstood their position?
There is no way, of course.
So where does, and in my mind, I don't have a problem with this, right? But how do we, because to my mind, the thing when you're talking about subhuman, it's about knowing your filters. So what Kelly's saying is, think what you think based on what you see and what you work out, but know that it's not the whole truth. And bear that in mind when you're developing your ideas, because you have to know what your filter is. Now, I have no problem with that, but then a positive would look at that slightly differently, and they would say, "No, it's there. We can see it. That's it." Yeah, but how can I know that when we know that we're right, but maybe we're not? Is that the point that you were making to Mike?
Yes.
Can I butt in and before or after Carmen answers you, please?
I've answered. The answer was yes.
Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted to point out is the terminology of positivism, because the context in which I work, the academic context, it has a very specific sort of philosophy of science. So let's say if we take our situation now with COVID and all this, we may each have different view, different understanding, construct different meaning of the pandemic. Okay. So we agree with that. So that's a kind of constructivist, what you're saying is the contract. It's allowing for different perspectives. Now, if I were a positivist researcher, my research would entail maybe surveying people and collecting views, about how many people think particular ways, understand the pandemic in particular ways and others not. If my statistics and data collection are done kind of robust, then that's the truth, that's the data, that is what, it shows. That's the reality of the different views in society. So it's a positivism, at least to an English sort of speaker or in English, someone who's immersed in a sort of social science context, as a somewhat different meaning than what you're describing, which is somebody like religious fanatics or people who are very kind of have very fixed ideas and beliefs or political beliefs or something like that are very radical and they would not change, right? I wouldn't call them positivist, but that's maybe a matter of terminology. So I don't know if we're, that we agree on the reality. Now, there is a caveat to that, because if I say that I'm a positivist researcher and I've done the statistics and collected data, and someone else could argue, and I would perhaps argue myself because I'm not a positivist researcher, that the very way that we structure surveys, the kind of question we ask people, the type of responses we collect, and the way we analyze it, it's itself imposing a particular interpretive system onto this reality. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, but I took Michael's and Shomo's reference to positivism as an example.
Yeah.
I mean, you could replace positivism with whatever positions is not your philosophical position.
Mm.
And the answer is, I believe that I can give a comprehensive and partial account of that position. But the person whose position that is will probably feel differently.
Okay.
And this is equally valid for any position.
Okay, that's it. I see a comment that people want to move on to the rest. So, and I also like to hear what else you're saying.
Okay, let me resume the PowerPoint presentation where I hope you can see the presentation. Now, I think we might cut a couple of slides. Okay, wonderful. What happened? We might.
Can we move on to Wolfgang Iser at some point?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And now, in what way can the experiential literature enhance therapist training? Now, in order to answer this question, I would like us all to consider at the outset just how literary texts work. And I feel we should start from two absolutely fascinating phenomenological inquiries on the reading process. And one is Georges Poulet's, and the other is Wolfgang Iser's. Now, the first consideration, which I hope we can keep in mind during what follows, is that the constructedness of our experience of a literary text is much more evident, much more prevalent, and therefore much easier to analyze than the constructedness of other experiences. Let's see how this happens. The literary text activates our own faculties, enabling us to recreate the world it presents. The product of this creative activity is what we might call the virtual dimension of the text, which endows it with its reality. This virtual dimension is not the text itself, nor is it the imagination of the reader. It is the coming together of text and imagination. With a literary text, we can only picture things which are not there. The written part of the text gives us the knowledge, but it is the unwritten part that gives us the opportunity to picture things. Indeed, without the elements of indeterminacy, the gaps in the text, we should not be able to use our imagination. The truth of this observation is borne out by the experience many people have on seeing, for instance, the film of a novel. With a novel, the reader must use his imagination to synthesize the information given to him, and so his perception is simultaneously richer and more private. With the film, he's confined merely to physical perception, And so whatever he remembers of the world he had pictured is virtually cancelled out. Now, as a consequence, the part personal constructs play in our response to literary texts is particularly salient and evident. It can be made the object of our consciousness. We can become aware of it. We can reflect on it. We can analyze it. We can explain it to other people. And why is that? One text is potentially capable of several different realizations, and no reading can ever exhaust its full potential. For each individual will fill the gaps in his own way, thereby excluding the various other possibilities. As he reads, he will make his own decisions as to how the gap is to be filled. In this very act, the dynamics of reading are revealed. By making his decision, he implicitly acknowledges the inexhaustibility of the text. At the same time, it is this very inexhaustibility which forces him to make this decision. The purpose of this is not to complicate the spectrum of connections so much as to make us aware of our own capacity for providing links. In such cases, the text refers back to our own preconceptions, that is, our own construct system, which are revealed, our constructs are revealed by the act of interpretation that is a basic element of the reading process. Of course, Iser has no idea that personal construct typology exists. Iser is a phenomenologist. However, Iser refers in this quote to what we label as the reader's personal construct system. And the awareness that the reader achieves in the act of reading of their own personal construct system. Therefore, reading is an example of construction processes made observable in their purest form, because whatever we read in the text, we're reading into the text. Therefore, we should not be surprised to find that the phenomenology of literature has devoted considerable interest to the central aspect of the construction process in the Kellyan sense, which is, as we all know, anticipation. In whatever way and under whatever circumstances the reader may link the different phases of the text together, it will always be the process of anticipation retrospection, which leads to the formation of the virtual dimension, which in turn transforms the text into an experience for the reader. The way in which this experience comes about through a process of continual modification is closely akin to the way in which we gather experience in life. And thus the reality, quote unquote, of the reading experience can illuminate basic patterns of real experience, that is, can make our construct systems conspicuous and accessible to awareness and analysis. Now, even if the only effect of reading with understanding were to gain a greater awareness of our personal construct systems and construction processes, in my opinion, this would be great. But it doesn't end here, because reading can also change our construct system in a way which has no parallel with any other experience. Please keep on thinking of James Baldwin's quote at the outset. If you can't be touched, you can't be changed. If you can't be changed, you can't be alive. So reading changes us. How? In the manner, as Iser writes, in which the reader experiences the text. This manner will reflect his own disposition. In this respect, literary texts acts as a kind of mirror. But at the same time, the reality, which this process helps to create, will be different from the reader's own. Thus, we have the apparently paradoxical situation in which the reader is forced to reveal aspects of himself, that is, of our construct system, in order to experience a reality which is different from his own. The impact this reality makes on him will depend largely on the extent to which he himself actively provides the unwritten part of the text. And yet, in supplying all the missing links, he must think in terms of experiences different from his own. Indeed, it is only by leaving behind the familiar world of his own experience that the reader can truly participate in the adventure the literary text offers him. And what does this feel like? This is what Poulet explained. The exploring effect in the case of a book is the falling away of the barriers between you and it. You are inside it, it is inside you, there's no longer either outside or inside. I am aware of a rational being, the consciousness of another, no different from the one I automatically assume in every human being I encounter, except that in this case, the consciousness is open to me, welcomes me, lets me look deep inside itself, and even allows me, with unheard of license, to think what it thinks and feel what it feels. We are starting to realize how reading makes change possible. This is Poulet again. Since everything has become part of my mind, thanks to the intervention of language, the opposition between the subject and its object has been considerably attenuated. And thus, the greatest advantage of literature is that I am persuaded by it that I am freed from my usual sense of incompatibility between my consciousness and its objects. Of course, in quote-unquote real life, we normally encounter other persons as objects of our consciousness. We do not think their thoughts. We do not feel their feelings. In reading, we are freed from this dichotomy. There is no longer I, my consciousness, and its object. I am someone who happens to have as objects of his own thoughts which are part of a book I'm reading, and which are therefore the cognitions of another. They are the thoughts of another, and yet it is I who am the subject. I am thinking the thoughts of another. Of course, there would be no cause for astonishment if I were thinking it as the thought of another, but I'm thinking it as my very own. I am a self who is granted the experience of thinking thoughts foreign to him. I am the subject of thoughts other than my own. My consciousness behaves as though it were the consciousness of another. Whenever I read, I mentally pronounce an I, and yet the I which I pronounce is not myself. J'ai un autre, said Rimbaud. Another I who has replaced my own, and who will continue to do so as long as I read. Reading is just that, a way of giving way not only to a host of alien words, images, ideas, but also to the very alien principle which utters them and shelters them. The phenomenon, Poulet goes on, is indeed hard to explain, even to conceive, and yet, once admitted, it explains to me what might otherwise seem even more inexplicable. For how could I explain, without such takeover of my innermost subjective being, the astonishing facility with which I not only understand, but even feel what I read? When I read as I ought, that is, without mental reservation, without any desire to preserve my independence of judgment, and with the total commitment required of any reader, my comprehension becomes intuitive, and any feeling proposed to me is immediately assumed by me. Reading implies something resembling the apperception I have of myself, the action by which I grasp straight away what I think as being thought by subject, who in this case is not I. Reading them is the act in which the subjective principle, which I call I, is modified in such a way that I no longer have the right, strictly speaking, to consider it as my I. I am alone to another, and this other thinks, feels, suffers, and acts within me. When I am absorbed in reading, a second self takes over, a self which thinks and feels for me. Someone else holds the center of the stage. Now, one would search in vain, I think, the literature on PCP for a more perfect and a more moving description of the nature and of the effects of the credulous attitude. Poulet had never heard of PCP, had never heard of Kellyan, but what Poulet is describing is the credulous attitude. However, this is not yet the most interesting theoretical point, because what Poulet gives us here in PCP terms is not only, in my opinion, an incredible description of the credulous attitude, but it is also an explanation of psychological change. We change one if, insofar as we make room in ourselves from an alien principle, as Poulet labels it, of construction. And we're willing to welcome and embrace the potentially very threatening takeover, what Poulet calls a second self, a self which thinks and feels for me. Now, if we keep hold of this idea, we realize why Poulet makes such a fuss about the preliminary event of the reading process, what he calls the disappearance of the object. Where's the book I held in my hands? It is still there. And at the same time, it is no longer. It is nowhere, for the book is no longer a material reality. It has become a series of words, of images, of ideas, which in their turn begin to exist. And where is this new existence? Not in the paper object, not surely in external space. There's only one place left for this new existence, my innermost self. I have changed. This is, I have changed is not Poulet, is a commentary on Poulet from a PCP standpoint. When actually, if we're able to actually practice the credulous approach, whatever, actually, more importantly, whoever is in front of us is no longer an object, is no longer a material reality, because we make our innermost self available and permeable to a principle of organization that is alien but is no longer external. By doing so, we change. The astonishment that Poulet writes about, I am a consciousness astonished by an existence which is not mine, but which I experience as though it were mine. This astonishment is brought about by the refutation of the solipsistic attitude implicit in everyday life through the overwhelming and irrefutable perception of the reality of another being incommensurable with our own and yet equivalent to our own. And this interdependence, which I am postulating between the credulous approach and change, is explained in more analytical terms by Iser. If reading removes the subject-object division that constitutes all perception, it follows the reader will be, quote-unquote, occupied by the thoughts of the other. And this, in their turn, will cause the drawing of new boundaries in PCP terms reconstruction. Text and reader no longer confront each other as object and subject, but instead the division takes place within the reader himself. In thinking the thoughts of another, his own individuality temporarily recedes into the background, since it is supplanted by these alien thoughts, which now become the theme on which his attention is focused, in PCP terms, credulous attitude. As we read, there occurs an artificial division of our personality because we take as a theme for ourselves something that we are not, again, credulous attitude. Consequently, when reading, we operate at different levels. For although we may be thinking thoughts of someone else, what we are will not disappear completely. It will merely remain as a more or less powerful virtual force. Now, in the act of reading, there are these two levels, the alien me and the real, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Thus in reading, there are these two levels, the alien me and the real virtual me, which are never completely cut off from each other. Indeed, we can only make someone else's thoughts into an absorbing thing for ourselves, provided the virtual background of our personality can adapt to it. It's always us who change. Every text we read draws a different boundary within our personality, so that the virtual background, the real me, will take on a different form. According to the theme of the text observed, this is inevitable, if only for the fact that the relationship between alien theme and virtual background is what makes it possible for the unfamiliar to be understood. Now, I will try to. Now, what is this all about? What is the theoretical purpose in a PCP perspective of engaging the work of Israel and Poulet? What I would like to do is to propose a description of the results of their phenomenological analysis of reading in PCP terms, in order to show that some phenomena, which are very important in PCP, but which PCP does not know how to purposely and systematically bring about, are structural and fundamental components of the reading process. Now, I will try to, in the last part of my presentation, summarize the constructivist concepts and experiences described in each of the passages I quoted and discussed. And for each one, I will suggest some exercises to be preferably executed in writing. The sum total of these exercises makes up a possible syllabus of a workshop about literature for PCP psychotherapy candidates. And this, in my opinion, is as good as a place as any to call a break. What do you think?
How long do you?
Shall we take a break?
So let's take a 10-minute break. So right now it is 8 minutes past the hour. Let's call it 10 minutes past the hour. Let's come back at 20 minutes past the hour.
Okay.
We'll see you all then.
Okay.
I believe that I shared a PDF document in which I wrote out the quotes that I've been sharing with you through the slides. And the reason why I did that is that I'm now going to show you slides which discuss those quotes. And what I would like to point out is that the theoretical constructs of the phenomenology of reading, Iser's constructs and Poulet's constructs, can help us make sense of our personal construct systems. Reading is a kind of a petri dish in which we can view some crucial aspects of our construct systems in a pure form, which makes it easier for us to observe them and to reflect upon them. When Iser says that the literary text activates our own faculties, enabling us to recreate the world it presents, when Iser says that with a literary text, we can only picture things which are not there, what Iser means in PCP terms, of course, is that reading makes us realize the constructedness of our experience. Now, the constructedness of our experience is not a PCP concept like many others. It is the fundamental article of faith of the constructivist position, both ontology and gnoseology. So this is absolutely basic, and is accordingly extremely useful. Now, some interesting questions we might ask is, what do I picture in not only images, but events, emotions, facts when reading these books? What gaps in the text, what unformulated places in the text allow me to use my imagination? Now, our construing is always constellatory, otherwise we would never anticipate anything. Believing that some experiences we're having entails some other experience we are not having is the essence of our anticipation, and is of course constellatory. Now, when I read the book, how do I picture things which are not in my experience, things which are not there in my experience of primary reality? That is, how do I anticipate? Because anticipating is, of course, something we all do. And except for moments of mystical, sublime meditation, and we anticipate all the time. How do we do this? The second Easer quote is about how one text is potentially capable of several different realizations. That is, there are as many experiences of the literary text as there are readers of that text. Mm. Whenever we discuss a book with a friend, we realize this. And this is extremely important because this is about our personal construct systems. Now, realizing the constructivism of our experience in Easer's terms refers us back to our own preconceptions. We can only become aware of what in ourselves triggers these feelings, makes us think, feel, believe, anticipate. Whatever we do, feel, think, believe, anticipate. The only way we can become aware of this is by looking at what triggers these feelings, beliefs, anticipations, and gives us the illusion that they originate in objective reality, which of course, by definition, from a constructivist viewpoint, they do not. So constructivism is not either the subject or the object in isolation. It's about the coming together of subject and object to produce an experience. Now, this exercise of how we experience is particularly easy to perform with literature because the external triggers of our experience of literature are discrete and easy to understand units, which are all there in front of us on the page, one after the other. Whereas primary reality is much more chaotic. When reading, we know we can point exactly to the word, to the sentence, which made us have the experience. We did not hallucinate the experience. Our experience was an experience of what is in the text. Now, questions which we might ask is, what parts and aspects of the text direct and constrain my use of my imagination in shaping my realization of the text? And of course, this becomes more interesting if we get other people involved. We read the same text, for instance, a short story. What do our different realizations of the text have in common? How do they differ? Which parts of the text did each of us give prominence to in order to construct our realization? Which part did each of us neglect? Can each of us guess why she chose to highlight or to neglect those parts in particular? What does our own personal realizations of the text tell us about our personal construct systems? Now let's look at the third Isar quote. In whatever way and under whatever circumstances, the reader may link the different phases of the text together. It will always be in the process of anticipation or retrospection, which leads to the formation of the virtual dimension, which in turn transforms the text into an experience for the reader. Now, this can help us become aware of the process of anticipation and retrospection. Now, the fundamental postulate says we always anticipate. The construction corollary implies that we always retrospect. As for construing, the nature of literary text, specifically they are being linear, composed of discrete units that we can concentrate on one after the other, offers us an ideal ground for increasing our awareness of our anticipation retrospection processes. But if we read very slowly, it becomes less hard to observe the succession of anticipation and retrospection, which takes shape in our minds as we come into contact with the text. Now, what do these ways of anticipating and retrospecting tell us about our personal construct system? How do they compare to others? As usual, we can discuss the experience of the same text with other people. And it's great. It's great fun, teaches us a lot. I won't reread all the excerpts because there are too many of them. These are all about the credulous attitude and change. If there's one thing we probably agree about after this hour together, is that to read is to practice the credulous attitude. But to practice the credulous attitude is to change. In PCP terms, the reading process is a process of change because it makes our construct system permeable to alien constructs and modes of construing. Now, in what way does this individual text draw new boundaries from my personality? Just what, in the words on the page and in my way of experiencing them, causes this to happen? Which parts, which aspects of my construct system seem to be more yielding? Which ones are more resistant to change? Which books or aspects and parts of books do I tend to accept? Which ones do I tend to reject and why? What does this analysis teach me about the virtual background of my personality? That is, about my construct system, which I can never perceive directly, of course, but whose existence I must always infer from individual acts and modes of construing. How do different texts do different boundaries within my personality? Which aspects of the text reality are most markedly different from my own? How do I go about construing them? Do I feel I changed in any way as a result? How and why? Are there any aspects of the text I rejected? Which ones and why? If new boundaries of my personality, which were drawn by my experience of the book, were to become permanent, how would my way of construing change? Which parts of aspects of the book would play the greatest part in this change? The sixth Isar quote is about self-reflexivity. That is, our becoming able to formulate our deciphering capacity. We become aware of our construct systems in reading. Now, to be a constructivist is to practice self-reflexivity, is to strive to become aware not only of the, by definition, constructed nature of our experience of reality, but specifically and analytically of the aspects and modes of our construing. In theory, any occasion of deciphering gives us the chance, as Isar writes, to formulate our own deciphering capacity. That is, of construing our construct system. However, reading gives us the chance to do so in the course of an activity that can be slowed down at will, and where the external triggers of our construction processes can be easily and unambiguously isolated and observed and analyzed at will. Now, we might ask ourselves what parts and what aspects of our own construct systems come to the foreground, either because they helped me or because they hindered me in formulating the alien thoughts of the book. These are just hints, proposals, suggestions for ways in which the experience of literary text might be used in PCP therapist training to make it possible to become aware and to adopt a self-reflexive attitude to the candidate's own construct systems, preferably working as a group. I would love to hear your questions, objections, doubts, or we can go split up into breakout rooms and then meet again, whatever the organizer think might be a good idea.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Trying to find a quote from Tom Ravenette. He writes, "People are, by and large, ignorant of their constructs and construct systems. And in this sense, their construct systems are part of that large aspect of living and experience which is taken for granted." And whilst I like very much what you're saying, or what the theorists are saying about somehow entering another construct system, becoming a subject to alien thoughts, I'm just a little worried that when they're saying that we become more aware of our own preconceptions and construings, that that's a bigger problem than that sounds in their words. I think I become aware of the material that my construct system is shaping. I become aware of the reality that my construct system governs and structures. But whether I become aware of the actual constructs or the preconceptions that I have would depend on reflexivity, which is not that easily achieved. I could go on, but that's probably enough.
I totally agree with you. Yes, that's right.
I've been intrigued by your analysis of the way I read novels. What I was reminded of was a problem we had with secretaries who were typing quite stressful and unpleasant letters about clinical material. And we realized that it was far harder when it's coming in through headphones to distance yourself from the text than it is when you're actually just reading and copy typing. So there's something about the very ways that we actually introject the text that's quite important.
And there's a positive version of that. It comes from Milton Erickson, who talked about his secretary typing up hypnotic transcripts that contained the idea of losing a headache, and finding that just by typing these transcripts, it was actually therapeutic, because she was sort of, without awareness, absorbing the idea of replacing the headache with comfortable comfort, etc.
This is fascinating. This is extremely interesting.
But how do you square my previous question? How do you square what they're saying is that we become very aware of our own construct system? I'm not sort of saying it's wrong, but I'm experiencing a bit of a contradiction between how much that's possible.
I'm not saying that it is possible to become completely aware of our construct system. I'm simply saying that the journey is so interesting, so intrinsically rewarding that it might make sense to undertake it.
Oh yeah.
Especially if it can be undertaken through reading and in conversation, in communion with others.
Mm.
Can I give an example of, I've done something like this with a group of teens. These are all children with social communication difficulties. And what we did was we took the things they were receiving on social media, the comments they were so things like "you're a bitch," "you're stupid," "you're fat," "you're ugly," all those sorts of things. Now these are kids who also have reading difficulties, so they were not able to read complex texts as such, and so we were limited to the words that they could read instantly, because I was wanting to get different levels of response from them, and them to analyze their different levels of response, so starting from interoceptive and upwards. And I'm just saying this because this was a really practical example I said of this, in that by giving them a slip of paper with it on, we were able to identify the first reaction, the feeling, and be able to classify that feeling as pleasant or unpleasant, and then build from that which word was the one that was unpleasant, whether it was put in the third person or second person or first person, that kind of level of response. So these were teens who were initially receiving messages like this on screen and having an instant response, which translated directly to an emotional reaction, which they translated to behavior. After the process of looking and breaking down those messages in the way that I'm talking about at these different levels of construing effectively, they did become far more aware of their own constructs and their own responses, to the extent that when they received messages later, their first response was actually to classify, to deconstruct, and from there they could decide whether they were going to accept the message as part of them, or whether they could see it as an object which they didn't necessarily have to engage in. But we had to go through quite a long process of breaking it down and classifying and reconstruing. And because it was in a group and they were developing a group construal of the meanings, that did work. From a therapeutic point of view, that did work. And I suppose I'm saying this because it was all basically written, and it was written material that teens come across on a regular basis. We're not talking text or novels here. We're just talking social messaging, but it did work.
This is tremendously interesting. Did you publish anything about this?
Not yet. It's a paper waiting to be written amongst hundreds of others.
Please do. Please do.
All right, at some point. I've got chapters to write, but yeah, okay. It was a useful thing to do, though, therapeutically.
It was extremely.
Coming back to your notion of the text and the interaction with the text, what struck me very much was that for me, I'm not especially constructing my experience from particular words or phrases. I'm not entrained to that. I'm entrained to the difficulty sometimes of following a particular plot and making my own sense of a plot. But everything that you said certainly applies at that level. And then it struck me, I have a Polish background and I'm sort of bilingual. And if I read a text with my Polish hat on, the narrative is somewhat different. Just as if I am walking along the street and have an experience, I can put a Polish hat on or an English hat on, and that experience is rather different. And we have this book here, probably the greatest text in Polish literature, the greatest poem in Polish literature. And I bought it because it's a parallel translation. Yeah. And I can read that and I can, play the amateur translator and ask how well has the translator translated the Polish. But actually, I can't answer that question. All I can do is to say, I can see what's going on in the Polish narrative. And the flavor is different. The flavor is different to the English narrative.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's like if you read ancient Greek, the ancient Greek poetry or plays in the original, and then you go and you read a translation. And if you read multiple translations, you really see the difference in constructs, in the author's constructs, actually, because they enhance, they pull out bits, they put other bits towards the background, and you do get a different flavor. If you read the Iliad or any other ancient text in different translations, you do get that flavor that you're talking about, Debbie. Definitely.
It's extremely interesting that you, Sandy, brought up Latin and Greek, because I don't know Polish, but I assume that Polish is a highly inflected language. Is it, Debbie?
Yes, very
yes,
Latin grammar. It has a Latin grammar.
Yes. So it enables a writer to achieve the same effects as Latin and Greek. As long as two words are the same case, you can space them apart and the reader will know that they belong together.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so on and so forth.
Yes, yes.
And it gives a completely different flavor to the experience of reading.
It does.
From English or even from Italian, because both English and Italian are not particularly, do not have cases. So I think, yes, I think I know what you mean, even though I don't know Polish.
But the ability to get that sense of connection and holding on to the idea is very dependent on your ability, your working memory, and on your ability to hold multiple ideas at the same time. So your cognitive capabilities will have a really significant effect on what you draw from that text.
Yes, on the other hand, I feel that cognitive abilities are not a given. They can be developed in dialogue with different experiences.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, that's what therapy, speech and language therapy is, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it.
Exactly. So that the more you engage with challenging texts, the more you will get out of these texts, I think.
Yeah, as long as the cognitive load doesn't become too much, because then people start to construe around text itself, and that's where you end up with people being blocked from trying to read, which is a whole different issue, but linked.
Can I just say that we've got 10 minutes left. I think it's too late now to do any breakout groups, but that doesn't matter. I think the discussion is brilliant. So I was just going to say that within the last 10 minutes, if there's any other people that haven't spoken yet that may want to bring some different points up or whatever.
Can I just throw something in? That was something that Carmen said, which just sort of tripped me up a little bit. There was one point where you said that constructivism is the coming together of subject and object to produce an experience. And I just thought that there's a sort of an ontological presumption there that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. But it is a constructivist presumption. It is, you know, if you say ontology is about how you choose to construct what you see in the world, then you can adopt that position. But actually, when you think about how we come to being ourselves, the I, the subjects that we are, it strikes me that it's actually through experience that we come to separate the subject and the object. It's not that by bringing subject and object together, we create experience. I think this ties in a little bit with some stuff that Michael was saying. Has he gone? Oh no, he's still there, Michael. Right at the start of this series about inactive embodiment in the world as being at the source of the formation of subject and object. And I just found this really interesting, because to me that statement that it's the coming together of subject and object to produce an experience, I just feel very uncomfortable with that, which is also partly why I feel very uncomfortable with a constructivist approach, notwithstanding that I can see the benefit of what you're talking about, Carmen, in terms of thinking about literature to try and help people to start to reflect on the way that they are construing the world. So I just wonder if anyone wants to comment on whether they also found that a little bit sort of tripped them up.
Isn't the unity of object and subject always present? The idea of intentionality, that whenever we're conscious, we're conscious of something, and that experience is absolutely governed by the way we construe it. There isn't anything but the way we construe it at that moment.
Seems to me that maybe the answer is, again, in both and perspective, how the object is constructed through the experience, and the object also is always in the experience. If you look at newborn babies, really, and you put an object in front of them that's interesting, even though babies can't reach until like 4 months and 8 months of age, they reach with their whole bodies. Their whole body reaches for the thing, right from birth almost. So that there's this subject-object distinction right there. But even so, the understanding of the object and its separation in consciousness is coming through the experience. It seems to me that there's a phenomenological both and going on there.
But do you think there's a subject there? I mean, you say there's this subject-object distinction.
I think that there's an implicit subject, yes. If a baby is sucking on a pacifier, and you make you create the pacifier in such a way that it'll get nutrients or not nutrients by sucking, and then you take away the contingency, the baby gets all messed up. Clearly, the baby has some sense of its own agency, even if it's not reflective, right from birth.
But then the question is whether that is the same as what we refer to when we say looking at a text as an object, and the coming together of the subject and the object as the formation of an experience of the text. Whether we can talk about this subject-object distinction at that level as being the same as the one that you're talking about, Michael, or whether we need to try and unpack that and think how you get from the baby to the reader being affected by a text.
There's something that in one of my favorite programs on the radio is the book club, and often it's most entertaining when I've no experience of the book that they're talking about, And it seems very apparent sometimes that these people, you can have 3 or 4 people sat around the table and they've read different books. They're talking about the same book, but their experience of it and what they've constructed in their own mind, they've identified different characters and different dynamics between the characters. And they get emotionally attached to their own constructs of those characters. And sometimes the arguments can get quite emotional. And I wonder if that has anything to do with what you're talking about. That there is something there that they're emotionally attached to.
But you see, I think there that the one might be being indicated is that this emotional attachment is not, you can't think of it just as a response to the book, but it is actually something about their whole way of forming their identification, their subjectivity, which is grounded or stabilized in emotional investments rather than in reason or logic or a reaction to text and word, which is kind of where when I think you equate constructivism to literature, there's a danger of losing sight of that very thing, Seamus, that very question that emotionality poses to us. And I think you're saying you can have 3 people who can so radically differently respond emotionally, and therefore also in that's saying something about their different subjectivities, which I think is really important. And I mean, personally, I feel that what's happening there in that emotional side of things is much more associated with how we form a distinction between ourselves as a subject and the perception of an objective world around us than it is as a response to a seemingly objective world around us. If you like, it's a deeper phenomenon that is leading to the creation of the distinction between the subject and the object, rather than a response that where you bring the subject and the object together, and that creates an experience. I don't know if that's been explained.
It feels a little bit like we're shedding the torch in different directions.
Yeah, which, Michael saying it's both and is perhaps also, very relevant there as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree about how the emotionality, the emotional response can be split off in a way that's that binary between that and some kind of objectivity, because I don't think, great thing about one of the great things about constructivism, Kelly, for me, is how emotion is tied into the process of understanding. It's not separate from.
Well, I wanted to say how grateful I am to Carmen for getting us involved with the reader in this way and bringing construct theory to bear to a field probably that had overlooked the perspective that we can offer in that field. And I just wanted to applaud her on her work of bringing our attention to all these issues, as complex as they are.
Thank you, Frank. I very much second that. And we're nearly there, so let's give Carmen a round of applause, literally, for me. Thank you so much, Carmen.
Thank you all for bearing with me for what I understand was probably too long a presentation. You've been an incredibly supportive and active audience. It was great to talk to you.
We had the breakout session as a large group, thanks to your legitimizing discussion from the first moment.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for the daft lady, which will be
what?
a very important reference point for me from now on.
Okay.
Okay, let me just say that in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have Massimo Giliberto, Francesca Del Rizzo, and Chiara Louis from the Institute of Constructivist Psychology in Padua. And they're going to be talking about politicians' communications in this era of COVID. So I hope you'll be able to make that. And I'm very conscious that because of their work schedule, they've hardly been able to attend any of these series. So it'll be great, particularly good to see them. So shall we close the session formally and finish the recording? We can always carry on talking a little bit in the bar, as it were, with our virtual pints or glasses of wine. So thanks again, Carmen, very much, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Harry, for organizing the series and for having me, of course.
It's a real pleasure. So I'll just stop this. How do I stop it?